They say power announces itself. They say authority walks through the door with brass buttons and a badge and a voice that commands a room before a single word is spoken. They say you can feel when someone important enters, that the air shifts, that people straighten involuntarily the way they do in the presence of something larger than themselves. They say all of this as though power is something you wear, something you display, something stitched into a uniform or laminated onto a card, or communicated through the particular pitch of a voice accustomed to being obeyed. But here's what those people never account for: the ones who don't need to announce anything at all. The ones who carry authority the way deep water carries pressure. Not visibly, not loudly, but absolutely and in every direction, and devastating to anything that doesn't understand what it's dealing with. Darren Pellerin believed in announcements. He believed, fundamentally, and with the unshakable conviction of a man who had never been seriously tested, that he could read a person in 3 seconds. Not the full picture, of course. Darren wasn't arrogant enough to claim omniscience. But the essentials? The baseline assessment? Whether someone deserved his full professional attention or a watered-down version that got them processed and out the door? 3 seconds. He'd been doing it for 11 years. White coat, bright lights, the low pharmaceutical hum of refrigerated medications and scanning equipment. This was his world, and in his world, his instincts were law. He had a habit, when he was bored or between customers, of clicking his retractable pen. Not rhythmically, not with any musicality, just click, pause, click. It drove his coworkers to distraction, but Darren didn't notice, because Darren had long since stopped noticing the things that bothered people around him. The pen was a symptom. The 3-second assessments were the disease. On a Wednesday afternoon in mid-October, the disease walked him off a cliff. The Hartwell Pharmacy on Grover Street occupied the corner unit of a strip mall that smelled perpetually of the Chinese restaurant 2 doors down and the laundromat exhaust vent on the other side. The floors were a pale linoleum flecked with gray, scuffed into a soft matte finish by years of rubber-soled shoes, and the shelving units along the aisles leaned slightly toward each other at the top, giving the whole interior the gentle compression of a place that had absorbed too many years without renovation. The fluorescent lights inside were the particular shade of white that made everyone look slightly unwell, which, given the clientele, was either ironic or appropriate, depending on your disposition. Along the east wall, a blood pressure cuff machine sat in a plastic housing the color of old cream, its display screen scratched in a diagonal line across the center, still functional, still used by a particular rotation of elderly regulars who came in on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and treated the whole apparatus as a minor social occasion. The pharmacy served a neighborhood that was predominantly working class, mixed in its demographics, and largely uninterested in the minor politics of who worked behind which counter. People came for their prescriptions. They waited, they left. Darren worked the primary dispensing window on Wednesdays. He had the kind of face that sat permanently between expressions, not quite a frown, not anything approaching a smile, just a flat, bureaucratic neutrality that he mistook for professionalism. He was 38, with a receding hairline he'd compensated for by cropping the rest very short, and a soft middle that his white coat did nothing to hide. He breathed through his nose at a volume slightly above what any room required of him, a sound like mild dissatisfaction on constant loop. His shoes were scuffed in a specific way, not from hard use, but from the dragging shuffle of someone who moved between workstations in tight quarters all day without ever fully lifting his feet. His name badge was clipped slightly too high, just below the lapel, and it tilted maybe 3 degrees to the left, which sounds trivial until you've looked at it for long enough and found yourself wondering whether anything in his workspace was precisely where it should be. He was in the back, clicking his pen over a medication log that required 2 more entries, when the bell above the front door announced a new customer. He didn't look up immediately. That was part of the system. Let them approach the window, let them state their business, then engage. Engagement on his terms, in his time. When he did glance up, his 3-second assessment clock started without him consciously starting it. The woman at the window was somewhere in her mid-50s, with deep brown skin and close-cropped natural hair that had gone silver at the temples. She wore a dark green quilted vest over a cream-colored linen blouse, dark slacks, and low-heeled shoes that spoke of someone who spent long hours on her feet and had made peace with that fact. She carried a leather tote bag on one shoulder, the kind that looks worn in a comfortable way rather than a neglected way, and she held a folded prescription slip between 2 fingers with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for things they shouldn't have to wait for. 3 seconds. Darren's assessment landed where it usually landed when a black woman of her approximate age appeared at his window on a Wednesday afternoon. Customer. Basic. Routine. Likely a maintenance medication, possibly something for blood pressure or cholesterol given the demographic. He'd process it, check the insurance, fill or deny, move on. He did not see the particular quality of stillness she carried, the kind of stillness that settles into a person after decades of absorbing information about every room they enter. He did not notice that her eyes, a very dark brown with a slight downward tilt at the outer corners, had already cataloged the prescription log he'd left open, the medication storage visible through the dispensary door, and the compliance notice partially obscured behind a stapler on his counter. He did not notice any of this because he had stopped looking after 3 seconds, and 3 seconds is barely enough time to see anything at all. She slid the prescription under the window partition. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was what a meteorologist might call calm with significant pressure building, smooth on the surface, carrying a great deal beneath it. Darren glanced at the slip without picking it up. He could read upside down. 11 years had made that reflex automatic. What he read made him reach for the slip properly, and he scanned it once, and then, a beat that seemed to exist outside normal time, he set it down and looked at her in a different way than he had before. Not a better way, just different. "What's this for?" he said. Not a question. A challenge dressed as a question. "It's a written prescription," she said. "The medication name and dosage are indicated on the form." "I can see that." He picked it up again, turned it over as though looking for something on the back that wasn't there, set it down again. "This is a controlled substance. It is a Schedule 4 medication, prescribed within the appropriate parameters by a licensed physician," she said. "The prescribing doctor's DEA number is on the form, as is my insurance information." Darren's pen clicked once. "I'm going to need to see 2 forms of ID." She looked at him for a moment, with an expression that was entirely without heat, the look of someone watching a process unfold that they have seen before and already know the ending of. She set her tote on the small counter ledge and opened it, withdrew a wallet, and produced her driver's license without comment. "2 forms," Darren said. "Your store policy, as posted on that sign directly behind you," she said, "requires 1 government-issued photo ID for controlled substance pickup. I've provided one." He glanced back at the sign. She was correct. He turned back and clicked his pen. "Policy also gives me discretion." "Discretion to what end?" she asked. Still no heat, just the question, precise and unanswered. "Discretion to request additional verification when I feel it's warranted." "And what has warranted it today?" Darren had no clean answer to that, which meant he was already in the territory where most reasonable people would have stopped and course-corrected. Darren was not, on this particular Wednesday, feeling like a reasonable person. He was feeling like a man whose authority was being questioned in his own window, in his own pharmacy, in his own 11 years of professional experience. "Are you a new customer?" he asked. I am. Then I can't confirm insurance eligibility until I run it through the system. And for new customers presenting controlled substance prescriptions, I have additional verification requirements. This was, to be precise about it, something he was inventing as he spoke. The pharmacy had standard onboarding procedures for new customers, and those procedures required exactly what the posted signs said they required. But Darren had learned, over 11 years, that people rarely pushed back when you cited policy with sufficient confidence, because most people didn't actually know what the policy was. She knew. "I'd like the name of your pharmacy manager," she said, "and I'd like you to formally decline to fill this prescription so that I have documentation of the refusal." Something flickered across Darren's face. Not quite recognition of danger, more like the awareness that this conversation had moved somewhere unexpected. "I'm not declining anything," he said. "I'm verifying. You've had my license for 90 seconds. The verification process for insurance typically takes under 3 minutes. If you're running my insurance, I'm happy to wait. If you're not running my insurance and instead choosing to delay service, that's a different matter, and I'd like it documented." "Lady." "My name is on the prescription," she said. "You have it in front of you." He looked down. Dr. Vivian Coles. He registered the doctor prefix the way a person registers something they've already decided not to give weight to. He saw it, filed it under self-applied titles without examining it further, and looked back up. "New customers with controlled substance prescriptions take longer to process," he said. "That's just how it is. If you don't want to wait, you can take your prescription elsewhere." Here is where it gets interesting. Most people, faced with that particular dismissal, take it elsewhere, said with that particular finality, fold. Not because they agree, but because they've done the math. The energy required to fight versus the energy required to walk to the next pharmacy. Most people choose the walk. It is not weakness, it is economy. It is the accumulated knowledge, built up over a lifetime of similar interactions, that some fights cost more than they return, that systems are designed to tire people out before they reach the part where accountability lives. The woman at the counter near the blood pressure machine had looked up from her phone during the exchange about the second form of ID. A man in paint-spattered work pants, waiting for a prescription of his own, had shifted his weight and was very carefully not looking at anything in particular. A teenager near the vitamin aisle had her earbud in, but her eyes tracking the window. No one intervened. No one filmed anything. They simply registered, the way people register things they recognize but cannot name, that something was happening here that was not routine. Vivian Coles had not come to this particular pharmacy by accident, and she had not come to walk away. "I'd like to speak to your manager," she said again, "and I'd like a written record of this interaction." Darren's nostrils flared with the deep breath of a man who has decided to escalate. He turned toward the back of the pharmacy and called, not walked, called for Sandra. Sandra Orr was 51 years old and had been the pharmacy manager at Hartwell Grover Street for 6 years. She was a small woman with quick eyes and the particular energy of someone who has spent decades managing other people's crises, and she came from the back with the brisk efficiency of someone who knew Darren well enough to know that when he called for her, the situation was rarely simple. She appeared at the dispensary window beside him, took in the scene, the woman, the prescription on the counter, Darren's posture, and performed her own rapid assessment. Hers took longer than 3 seconds, and it arrived at a very different place. "Can I help you?" Sandra asked, directing this at the woman at the window. "I hope so," she said. "I've presented a valid prescription and a government-issued photo ID. I've been waiting for insurance verification that, to my knowledge, hasn't been initiated. I've requested documentation of any formal refusal, and I've been told to take my prescription elsewhere. I'd like to understand what's actually happening here." Sandra looked at Darren. Darren clicked his pen. "New customer protocol for controlled substances," he said. "Run the insurance," Sandra said. I was getting to. Run it now, please." There was a short, loaded silence. Darren turned to the computer, typed with the specific aggression of a man who believes he is being undermined, and ran the insurance. The system returned a response in 40 seconds. He stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, then looked at Sandra rather than the woman at the window. "Insurance is valid," he said. "Then fill the prescription," Sandra said. What happened next was the moment that turned a bad afternoon into something considerably worse. Darren, rather than accepting the obvious conclusion, fill the prescription, end the interaction, move on with his Wednesday, made the decision that would define the next several years of his life. "I'm not comfortable filling this," he said. Sandra went very still. "I have the right to decline a prescription on professional grounds," he continued, which was technically true in the most strained reading of pharmaceutical professional discretion standards, and which he was applying here in a way that had nothing to do with any professional concern he could have credibly articulated. "I'm declining." The woman at the window, Dr. Vivian Coles, as the prescription said, as her license said, as 11 years of Darren's professional experience had apparently not been sufficient to cause him to examine further, looked at Darren with the expression of someone who has just watched someone hand them exactly what they came for. "I'd like that in writing," she said. "The formal declination, the reason given, your full name and license number, and the time and date. Please." Darren blinked. "We don't do written." "Your state pharmacy board requires written documentation of all formal prescription declinations upon customer request," she said. "That's 21 CFR 1306.11, cross-referenced with your state's Pharmacy Practice Act, subsection on pharmacist rights and corresponding patient rights. I'd like the documentation." Sandra was already reaching for a form. Her hands were not entirely steady. Darren, for the first time in this interaction, seemed to become aware that something was wrong with his arithmetic. The woman hadn't raised her voice, hadn't cried, hadn't threatened, hadn't performed distress for the benefit of the other customers who had drifted to the edges of the waiting area, not quite watching and watching completely. She had simply known, precisely and exhaustively, what his obligations were and what hers were. That kind of knowledge didn't come from Google. That kind of knowledge was structural. It lived in a person because they had built it there over years, over institutions, over a career spent inside the machinery. He began filling out the declination form. His pen clicked 3 more times. Sandra excused herself to the back of the pharmacy. She went directly to her office, sat down, and typed the name from the prescription into a search engine with the careful focus of someone who suspects they already know what they're going to find and needs to be certain before they say anything out loud. The first result was the state government's official website. Dr. Vivian Coles, State Health Commissioner, appointed 4 years ago, previously served as Deputy Commissioner for Pharmaceutical Oversight for 8 years prior to that. Among her responsibilities as commissioner, licensing oversight for all pharmacies operating within the state, including, and Sandra's eyes moved very slowly across this particular phrase, enforcement authority over pharmacy technician licensing. Sandra sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. Then she stood up and walked back to the dispensary floor, and her face had taken on a quality that Darren, had he been paying better attention, would have recognized as the early stages of a very serious problem. She said his name quietly. He looked up from the form. "Step back here with me," she said. "Right now." He stepped back. She closed the dispensary door. She turned her monitor toward him and let him read the screen. Darren's pen stopped clicking. His pupils dilated in a way that had nothing to do with the lighting. His jaw went through several positions without settling on any of them. The color that departed his face did so in a visible wave, starting from the top of his forehead and receding downward like a tide going out, leaving behind a particular grayish quality that his skin had never had before, and which Sandra suspected would linger. "Oh," he said. It was not adequate, but it was what he had. "Go back out there," Sandra said, "and give her the medication." "Sandra, Darren." Her voice was very quiet. "Go give her the medication." He went. He filled the prescription with hands that were not entirely steady. He slid it under the window partition without making eye contact. He said, in a voice that aspired to normalcy and did not quite reach it, "Here you go." "Thank you," she said. She picked it up, checked the label with the methodical precision of someone who has spent decades knowing that errors happen and that checking is not paranoia, but professionalism. The label was correct. She tucked it into her tote. "I'll also need a copy of that declination form," she said. "Even though the prescription has now been filled, the documented refusal is still a documented refusal." He produced the form. She folded it. She put it in her tote alongside the medication. "Have a good afternoon," she said, and walked to the door, and left. The bell above the door made the same sound it always made. The fluorescent lights hummed. 2 customers in the waiting area stared at the door for a moment, and then looked at their phones. Darren stood at the window and thought, with a despair that was just beginning to take on its full dimensions, that he had made a very serious mistake. He had made several. The formal complaint landed on the State Pharmacy Board's desk within 48 hours, and it arrived not as a phone call or a vague grievance, but as a precisely organized packet of documentation. The declination form with Darren's name and license number, the prescription with the valid insurance confirmation timestamp from the pharmacy's own system, a written account of the interaction including direct quotes, the posted store policy that contradicted Darren's stated reasoning, and, stapled to the back, a printed copy of the relevant section of the State Pharmacy Practice Act outlining patient rights regarding prescription declinations and the specific grounds on which pharmacist discretion could be legally invoked. Professional grounds, as it turned out, required an articulable professional concern. "I'm not comfortable" did not constitute one. The woman who filed the complaint had, in her capacity as State Health Commissioner, spent the previous 4 years arguing to the state legislature for expanded enforcement powers for the Pharmacy Board. She knew every member of that board by name. Several of them had been appointed during her tenure. She had no intention of using that familiarity improperly. The complaint went through standard channels, with a formal recusal from any direct proceedings, but the Pharmacy Board understood, collectively and immediately, that this complaint was not going to be the kind that sat in a folder for 8 months. Darren was notified of the formal investigation on a Friday morning. He was at home, still in the early stage of trying to convince himself that it would probably be fine, that these things often came to nothing, that the board had bigger concerns. His manager had already called him that morning, not to reassure him, but to inform him that the pharmacy's parent company had retained counsel, and that he should do the same. He spent most of that Friday on the phone with people who delivered news in increasingly specific increments of bad. His union representative told him the union would support him through the process, but that the facts, as they had been summarized, were not favorable. His attorney, reached that afternoon, listened to his account of the interaction and asked one question. Was there a documented clinical reason for the declination? Darren said there wasn't. His attorney said he'd be in touch. The investigation ran for 6 weeks and was, by the standards of professional licensing investigations, unusually thorough. This was partly because the board took the case seriously, and partly because an investigator named Harris, a compact, methodical man in his early 40s who had spent 14 years reviewing pharmacy misconduct cases and had the particular patience of someone who understood that the records always tell more than the people do, began pulling Darren's declination history from the pharmacy's dispensing system and found something that caused him to sit back in his chair and look at the ceiling for a full minute. In the previous 3 years, Darren had formally or informally declined to fill or had applied extended verification protocols to 47 prescriptions. The demographic breakdown, when mapped against the pharmacy's customer database, was not subtle. 39 of the 47 were Black customers. 6 were Latino. 2 were white, both elderly, both involving insurance complications that were documented in the system and had nothing to do with Darren's discretion. The disparity was 83%. Harris documented this. He then cross-referenced the declined or delayed prescriptions with customer complaint records. He found 4 prior complaints against Darren specifically, all from Black customers, all citing unexplained delays or outright refusals. He found that 2 of those complaints had resulted in what the pharmacy's internal process called counseling conversations, which appeared in practice to mean that a supervisor had spoken to Darren informally and noted the conversation in a file that no one subsequently acted on. The notes were brief. One read, "Discussed importance of consistent policy application. Employee acknowledged feedback." That was the entirety of the accountability trail. 9 words and a checkbox. He also found a letter written 18 months earlier by a woman named Dominique Warren, a 34-year-old diabetic who had been told by Darren that her insulin prescription, insulin, which is not a controlled substance, which requires no special verification, which is, in the most clinical terms possible, a medication people die without, could not be filled because he needed to confirm the prescribing physician's current license status. She had waited 40 minutes while Darren did not, in fact, confirm anything, and had ultimately left without her medication and driven 40 minutes to another pharmacy. She had written in her letter that she had felt humiliated, that she had been visibly unwell when she arrived, her blood sugar had been unstable for 2 days, and that being made to wait and then turned away had been not just an inconvenience, but a health risk. She had asked, at the end of her letter, in language that was measured and careful and clearly written by someone who did not want to seem unreasonable, whether what had happened to her was normal, whether it was allowed, whether anyone would look into it. Dominique Warren had filed a complaint. The complaint had been internally reviewed and assigned to a supervisor who wrote, "No policy violation found," in the notes section and closed it. Harris flagged this with a yellow sticky note that said, in his small, precise handwriting, "Prior complaint, inadequate response, similar pattern." He attached it to a memo that went to the full board. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in late January, held in the state board's offices in a building downtown that smelled of recirculated air and old carpet, and the specific institutional quiet of a place where people's professional lives were decided. The conference room where the panel convened had a long table of dark laminate and chairs upholstered in a burgundy fabric that had seen better years, and along one wall a row of windows that admitted a flat winter light insufficient to warm anything. Darren arrived in a suit he'd bought for the occasion, charcoal gray, which fit him in the shoulders and not quite everywhere else. His attorney wore a better suit and carried a leather briefcase and sat beside him with the composed stillness of someone who has learned to manage expectations without quite saying so aloud. Across the table, the 7 board members arranged themselves in a slight arc, not facing him from behind a raised bench like a courtroom, but at the same table, which should have felt less adversarial and somehow did not. Darren sat at a table with his attorney to his left, facing the panel. Harris sat to the side, with his files stacked in precise order before him, each section tabbed. The commissioner did not appear at the hearing. Her office was formally recused from the proceedings, and she was, on that Tuesday, at a legislative session in the state capitol, arguing for a pediatric health funding allocation. Her complaint and documentation had already done what it was going to do. The facts spoke with a clarity that required no additional testimony from her. Harris presented the investigation's findings methodically, beginning with the incident that had triggered the complaint and moving through the 3-year pattern with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent weeks making sure there was no angle left unexamined. The 83% demographic disparity, the 4 prior complaints, the Dominique Warren letter, the 2 counseling conversations that had produced no change in conduct, the specific language of the State Pharmacy Practice Act regarding the criteria for professional declination, and the ways in which I'm not comfortable fell outside every one of those criteria. Darren's attorney argued professional discretion. He cited case law about the scope of pharmacist judgment. He was thorough and sincere, and working with material that had a structural problem, which was that professional discretion, as established in both statute and case law, required a professional rationale, a documented concern tied to the medication, the prescriber, the patient history, or the interaction profile. I'm not comfortable didn't appear anywhere in that framework. It was not a clinical observation. It was a feeling, and feelings, the law had long established, were not sufficient grounds for denying someone access to medically necessary treatment. Darren's attorney knew this. He made the argument anyway, because that was his job, and because there was no other argument available. One board member, a former clinical pharmacist named Dr. Amara, asked Darren directly, "At the time you declined, what was your clinical concern?" Darren said he'd had concerns about the appropriateness of the prescription. Dr. Amara asked him to specify those concerns. He couldn't. She wrote something on her notepad and did not ask another question. The board deliberated for 4 hours. Their findings, delivered in a written determination that ran to 11 pages, established the following: that Darren Pellerin had violated the State Pharmacy Practice Act's provisions against discriminatory dispensing practices, that the pattern documented over 36 months constituted a systemic rather than isolated violation, that prior complaints had been handled inadequately at the supervisory level, a finding which the board transmitted separately to the pharmacy's parent company for regulatory review, that the specific incident of October 15th, the refusal to fill a valid prescription from a licensed physician for a patient with valid insurance in the absence of any articulable clinical concern, was the paradigmatic example of a practice that had been ongoing and harmful. Darren Pellerin's pharmacy technician license was revoked, not suspended, not placed on probationary status with conditions, revoked. He was informed that he was ineligible to apply for reinstatement for 5 years, and that any reinstatement application would require documented evidence of professional education, supervised practice under oversight, and a board review of his conduct record. His attorney called the outcome severe. The board's determination noted, in its final paragraph, that the severity of the sanction reflected both the individual violations and the documented pattern, and that the protection of patient access to medically necessary prescriptions was among the board's primary obligations. The pharmacy's parent company, under separate pressure from the board's transmission and from a civil rights complaint that had been filed concurrently in federal district court, reached a settlement 6 months later. The settlement terms included a comprehensive audit of dispensing practices across all 17 of the company's in-state locations, mandatory bias and discrimination training for all pharmacy staff, the installation of a patient advocacy system that allowed customers to report dispensing concerns directly to a third-party ombudsman rather than through internal channels, and a financial settlement that the company did not disclose publicly, but which sources familiar with the matter described as substantial. The Ombudsman Program, a structural change that the Commissioner's Office had been advocating for through legislative channels for 3 years prior, was now not just law, but funded practice, built into the day-to-day operations of 17 locations serving hundreds of thousands of patients. The state legislature, in its spring session the following year, passed the Pharmacy Patient Protection Act, which expanded the board's enforcement authority and created mandatory documentation requirements for all prescription declinations statewide. The bill passed with bipartisan support. The commissioner testified in its favor before the Health Committee for 40 minutes, citing, among other things, the findings from the Hartwell investigation and the demographic data that Harris had compiled. She did not mention her own experience at the Grover Street location specifically. She didn't need to. The committee members had read the investigation report. The two prior supervisors who had reviewed and dismissed Dominique Warren's complaint were both subject to internal disciplinary proceedings. One resigned before the process concluded. The other received a formal demotion and was removed from any supervisory authority over complaint review. As for Dominique Warren, she was contacted directly by an investigator from the civil rights complaint process, and her original complaint was formally reopened and addressed as part of the settlement. She was included in the patient advocacy provisions and received a direct apology from the company's regional director, written, formal, and specific in its acknowledgement of what had happened and what had been done wrong. She told a friend afterward that it was the first time in her experience that an institution had used the words, "We failed you," and appeared to actually mean them. She also said, after a pause, that she wished it hadn't taken a state health commissioner walking into the same pharmacy to make it happen. That part, she said, she was still thinking about. Darren Pellerin, for his part, spent the first months after the revocation in a state of suspended disbelief. He had told his attorney, and anyone who would listen, that the outcome was disproportionate, that he had made a mistake perhaps, but that the pattern finding was overreach, that the 83% figure was a statistical artifact that didn't account for context. He said these things with the conviction of someone who has not yet understood that the argument they are making is the problem, not the solution. His attorney had stopped returning his calls by the third month, once the appeals window had closed and the board's determination had held. He found work, eventually, at a warehouse distribution center on the eastern edge of the city. The hours were early, the pay was roughly half what he'd made as a licensed technician, and the fluorescent lights bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the ones at Hartwell Grover Street. His colleagues did not know his history, which was both a mercy and a kind of ongoing unresolution. The story had nowhere to land, internally, when there was no one around him who understood what he'd lost or why. He saw, once, on a television mounted in a break room, a brief clip from a press conference at the state capitol. The state health commissioner was at the podium, discussing new pharmacy access legislation that would expand enforcement mechanisms for discriminatory dispensing practices. She looked composed and purposeful, and completely at ease with the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that simply operates, the kind that was always there whether anyone chose to see it or not. Darren watched the clip for 11 seconds and then looked away. Whether he felt anything he could have named or learned anything he could have applied, whether the 11 seconds produced any genuine reckoning or just the continuation of a low, unexamined resentment, that only Darren knows. What the rest of us can observe is what was documented: a complaint filed, a pattern found, a license revoked, and a system that, at least in this instance, produced a consequence that matched the harm. That doesn't always happen. Anyone who tells you it always happens is either lying or hasn't been paying attention. But when it does happen, when the documentation is complete and the process holds and the outcome is proportionate, and the institutions don't collapse under the weight of their own inertia, it tends to happen because someone decided not to walk away. Because someone knew exactly what forms to ask for, exactly what statutes applied, exactly what evidence would matter. Because someone had built that knowledge into themselves over years and decades, and showed up one Wednesday afternoon to a strip mall pharmacy in a quilted vest, and was dismissed in 3 seconds, and waited. She didn't need to announce herself. She never does. That's not where the power lives. The power lives in what comes next, in the 48 hours, in the 11 pages, in the name of every patient who filed a complaint and was told, in so many words, that they hadn't been heard. In Dominique Warren's insulin, finally filled somewhere else, 40 minutes away, by someone who did their job. Power announces itself, or so they say. What they don't say, what they never get around to saying, is that the most durable kind doesn't need to. If this story made you stop and think about what it means to actually hold someone accountable, not just in the moment, but through the slow grind of process and documentation and formal consequence, drop that in the comments. If you've ever been dismissed somewhere you had every right to be, you know the specific weight of that moment. Share it. And if the 17 people behind the pharmacy counter still don't know what Vivian Coles looks like, consider that this story will have been watched by several 100,000 people before Darren's license reinstatement window even opens. Tap the like if this one landed. Stay with us for the ones still coming. Ring that bell, because these stories find people who need to hear them, and the next one might be someone you know.